Have you ever felt crushed by the weight of your own mistakes, convinced that you have wandered too far to ever be found? You are not alone in that darkness. This is the opening of John Bunyan's raw autobiography, Grace Abounding to the Chief of Sinners. Before he penned the timeless classic, The Pilgrim's Progress, Bunyan lived through a harrowing psychological storm. He didn't view himself merely as flawed. He believed he was the chief of sinners, utterly abandoned by God and beyond repair. In this journey, we peel back the layers of a tormented mind, a man haunted by intrusive thoughts, paralyzed by the fear of eternal judgment, drowning in guilt. It sounds tragic, but this is actually a story of ultimate triumph. Why? Because the depth of his fall highlights the incredible reach of the rescue. We're about to explore how Bunyan discovers that grace is not a fragile thing. It is a relentless, aggressive power that hunts down the lost. This isn't just history. It's a mirror for the modern soul searching for peace in a world of anxiety and pressure. Prepare to understand the paradox. The heavier the burden of sin, the more miraculous the power of grace becomes when it finally lifts the weight. Picture this: 17th century England. A young man covered in soot, hammering dented pots for pennies. No education, no prospects, no hope. That was John Bunyan. Born into the lowest social rank, trained as a tinkerer, traveling mender of metal pots and pans. He describes his own upbringing as mean and inconsiderable, possessing no formal education, no wealth, and seemingly no future beyond the anvil. Yet within this humble tradesman burned a terrifyingly vivid imagination. As a young man, Bunyan was far from a saint. By his own admission, he was a ringleader in vice, plagued by vivid nightmares of hellfire, and consumed by a habit of cursing that shocked even the most hardened of his neighbors. This isn't the polished memoir of a detached scholar. It's the raw, beating heart of a common man wrestling with the Almighty. A story of how a poor tinker found himself trapped in a psychological cage of despair, only to be liberated by a grace he felt he never deserved. As we embark on this narrative, prepare to witness the intense battleground of a soul moving from deep darkness into marvelous light. His story begins in rebellion. To truly grasp the magnitude of grace, we must first measure the sheer depth of the fall. I was born into a lowly state in Bedfordshire. My father, a simple tinkerer, my education barely enough to read and write. But it wasn't my poverty that defined my early years. It was my profound wickedness. From a tender age, Bunyan didn't simply stumble into sin. He sprinted toward it. Cursing, lying, and blaspheming became second nature. He became a ringleader among the local youth, guiding them into vice rather than virtue. Yet, even in this darkness, something or someone was watching. Vivid, terrifying nightmares of hell would shake him awake, leaving him trembling. But by morning, he'd shake them off and return to his rebellion with renewed vigor. God's hand intervened physically too, though he refused to see it. Once he fell into a creek and barely escaped drowning. Another time he handled a poisonous adder, completely oblivious to the lethal danger. Perhaps most hauntingly, during his military service, a soldier took his place on the line and was shot dead moments later with a musket ball to the head. Bunyan was spared again and again. Yet he remained blind, ungrateful, hardened against the Almighty. Think about the close calls in your own life, the car accident that almost happened, the illness you narrowly avoided. Were they mere coincidence? Or was there a hand you couldn't see? This was Bunyan's beginning, a life devoted to self-destruction, unaware that divine intervention was approaching. Marriage changed everything. Though Bunyan and his wife were incredibly poor-possessing, not even a dish or a spoon between them, she brought a dowry of 2 pious books left by her father. These writings compelled Bunyan to attempt an outward reformation. He became a dedicated churchgoer, singing with the congregation and idolizing the clergy. Yet, despite this religious performance, his tongue remained sharp with curses, and his heart remained untouched by true grace. Then came the Sabbath that altered his destiny. After hearing a sermon condemning Sunday sports, Bunyan felt a heavy burden of guilt, but his addiction to pleasure proved stronger. Later that day, he returned to the village green to play a game of cat. Just as he prepared to strike the wooden piece, a sudden, supernatural clarity froze him. He heard a voice not audible to others, but thunderous to his soul, asking a terrifying question. Wilt thou leave thy sins and go to heaven, or have thy sins and go to hell? He looked up, imagining the Lord Jesus looking down upon him with hot displeasure. But rather than surrendering, Bunyan fell into a trap of despair. He calculated that he was already too far gone for redemption. Here's the tragic irony. Believing hope was lost, he made a devastating resolve. If he was bound for hell, he might as well enjoy sin to the fullest. He shook off the conviction and returned to his game, desperate to silence the awakening voice. How many of us do the same? When conviction comes, we don't surrender, we rationalize, we numb, we distract, we return to the game. But this voice, it would not stay silent. In the course of his work, Bunyan traveled to Bedford to ply his trade as a tinker. There, in one of the streets, he saw 3 or 4 poor women sitting by a door in the warm sunlight, deep in conversation about the things of God. Being a brisk talker on religious matters himself, he drew near to listen. However, as he stood there, he realized he was entirely out of his depth. Their talk wasn't merely intellectual. It was about a new birth, the work of God in their hearts, how they were convinced of their miserable state by nature. They spoke of how God had visited their souls with his love in the Lord Jesus, how they were refreshed by his words and promises. They discussed the temptations they faced, how they were assaulted, and how they resisted. Bunyan writes, "They spoke with such pleasantness and scriptural assurance that they seemed to me as if they had found a new world. Imagine stumbling upon people who've discovered a secret you've been searching for your entire life. That's what this moment was. These weren't scholars or priests. They were poor women sitting in the sun. Yet they possessed a peace Bunyan had never known. His heart began to shake. For all his religious talk, he knew nothing of this new birth or the true comfort of God's promises. He left them, but their words stayed with him, igniting a hunger he'd never felt before. He clearly saw he was still on the outside, merely looking in at true faith. Before we continue Bunyan's journey, if this story is resonating with you, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. This is a journey we're taking together, and there's so much more ahead. Just as Bunyan began to embrace faith, a paralyzing darkness descended upon him, a psychological tempest that threatened to tear his sanity apart. Bunyan became obsessed with a terrifying thought that he had sold his birthright like Esau in the scriptures. He was convinced he had committed the unpardonable sin and that his day of grace was past. This wasn't a casual worry. It was a relentless, crushing weight. He describes walking through the countryside, envying the birds and toads because they didn't have a soul capable of eternal damnation. He felt singular in his wretchedness, completely isolated from the hope of salvation. He turned to the Bible for relief, but the words turned to ash in his mouth. Texts that promised mercy seemed to skip over him, while verses of judgment pierced his heart like daggers. If you've ever experienced depression or anxiety, you know this feeling. When your own mind becomes a prison. When hope feels like a language you no longer speak. But here's what Bunyan will later understand. This agony wasn't the end. It was the refining fire. A heart that didn't care about God wouldn't break over losing him in this storm. Bunyan wasn't being destroyed. He was being deepened, prepared for a grace that would prove greater than his darkest doubts. The question wasn't whether the storm would pass. The question was, what would emerge on the other side? Now we descend into the absolute depths of Bunyan's crisis. He found himself walking through the countryside, not admiring its beauty, but deeply envious of the animals around him. He looked at the birds in the trees, the toads in the ditches, and wished with all his heart to trade places with them. Why? Because they had no sinful nature. They had no soul to lose and no judgment day to face. To Bunyan, being human was a curse because it carried the potential for eternal damnation. His mind became a battlefield of intrusive thoughts. Modern psychology would call this obsessive-compulsive disorder or severe anxiety. Bunyan called it hell on earth. He became obsessed with the idea that he had committed the unpardonable sin, that he had somehow rejected Christ so fully that there was no coming back. Scriptures that used to bring comfort now felt like sharp swords pointed at his chest. He felt cold, hardened, utterly abandoned by God. It wasn't just sadness. It was a terrifying isolation where the heavens seemed made of brass, impenetrable to his prayers. This was the valley of despair, a place where hope seemed like a distant memory, and the weight of eternity crushed the joy out of every waking moment. But valleys have another side, and at the bottom of the deepest darkness, there's often nowhere to go but up. What Bunyan could unsee yet was that he was about to witness the truth of an ancient promise. My grace is sufficient. Here we encounter the climax of John Bunyan's internal war. For months, Bunyan was paralyzed by the terrifying thought that he was beyond redemption. He felt physically worn down by guilt, convinced he had thrown away his salvation. But just as despair seemed absolute, a breakthrough occurred. While wandering through a countryside field, terrified by his own thoughts, a sentence suddenly bolted into his consciousness. My grace is sufficient for thee. My grace is sufficient for thee. It wasn't a whisper, it was a roar. The words repeated in his mind. My grace is sufficient, over and over again. He realized this wasn't merely a text to read, but a living promise to hold. Bunyan writes that his understanding of grace shifted entirely. He saw that his standing with God did not depend on the strength of his own heart, but on the sufficiency of Jesus. Whether he was up or down, the grace remained constant. Think about that. Your worthiness doesn't fluctuate with your mood. Your acceptance doesn't depend on your performance. The foundation holds even when you're shaking. Wow. It was as if scales fell from his eyes. He understood that his sin was finite, but God's grace was infinite. This moment didn't instantly cure every doubt forever, but it provided a bedrock foundation. It taught him and us that when our strength ends, God's grace truly begins. It is the ultimate safety net for the falling soul. After his breakthrough, Bunyan sought out the poor women he had overheard in Bedford. They directed him to Mr. Gifford, the pastor of their fellowship. Gifford's teaching was different from anything Bunyan had heard before. He pressed his congregation to take special heed not to accept any truth upon trust alone, but to cry mightily to God that he would convince them of its reality. Joining this fellowship wasn't just about social connection. It was the beginning of true discernment. Here, Bunyan started to see the difference between religious performance and a genuine, heart-changing relationship with grace. In modern terms, think of it like finding your tribe. Not just people who share your interests, but people who understand your struggles, who've walked through their own valleys and can light the path through yours. It was among these humble believers that Bunyan began to understand what it meant to truly enter the fold of faith, not as a perfect person, but as a wounded traveler finding refuge and community. And from community came calling. After finding his footing in the fellowship, Bunyan faced a new, unexpected challenge. The congregation began to recognize that within his intense battles lay a distinct gift for articulation and empathy. The elders approached him, urging him to speak a word of exhortation to the community. Bunyan's initial reaction: sheer terror. He withdrew, feeling utterly unworthy of such a holy task, viewing himself as too flawed and weak to lead others. But the community's requests didn't cease. They recognized a fire in him that couldn't be extinguished. With great trepidation, he eventually agreed to speak in private gatherings. The result was immediate and undeniable. His words carried weight, comforting the sorrowful and convicting the comfortable. Encouraged by this fruit, he ventured further, traveling to neighboring villages where the gospel was yet unknown. Bunyan realized a powerful paradox. His terrifying history with guilt and despair became his greatest asset. He could speak to the lost, not as a distant scholar, but as a fellow sufferer who had found the cure. He preached what he felt, often trembling as he spoke, acutely aware that he was a prisoner, bringing news of freedom to others in chains. This was no longer just a career change. It was the divine mobilization of a man who had survived the abyss. If you're finding strength in Bunyan's story, take a moment to like this video and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Your engagement helps this message reach those still searching. The year 1660, the English monarchy had been restored, and with it came strict laws against nonconformist religious gatherings. Bunyan was invited to preach at a farmhouse in Semsel, Bedfordshire. Before the meeting began, he was tipped off that a warrant had been issued for his arrest. He faced a critical choice: escape to safety or stand his ground. He chose to stay. Why? Because flight would be interpreted as an admission of guilt or cowardice, thereby discrediting the gospel he served. While he was speaking, the constable entered and arrested him. Bunyan was brought before Justice Wingate for interrogation. The authorities were willing to let him go, provided he gave his word to cease preaching to the public. Bunyan could not compromise his conscience. He famously replied, "If I were released today, I would preach again tomorrow by the help of God." This refusal sealed his fate. He was sent to Bedford jail, where he would remain for 12 years. This decision was not made lightly. Bunyan was leaving behind a wife and 4 children, one of whom was blind. The anguish of this separation was immense. Yet he viewed his suffering as a necessary testimony to the truth. Here's the profound irony. In that confinement, his greatest literary works were born. The cell became a cathedral. The chains became his pulpit. And from that darkness came the Pilgrim's Progress, a book that would inspire millions. Sometimes our greatest ministry comes from our deepest suffering. As we draw the curtains on grace abounding to the chief of sinners, Bunyan ends not with a declaration of sinless perfection, but with a humble acceptance of his continued dependence on God. In his closing remarks, he addresses his spiritual children, offering final observations about the nature of sin and grace. He warns that the heart is deceitful and that true religion is not merely about avoiding evil, but about the power of a new life within. He famously compares his soul to a broken vessel that can only hold the water of life because of God's constant refilling. The legacy of this autobiography is monumental. It is widely regarded as the psychological blueprint for his later masterpiece, The Pilgrim's Progress. By meticulously documenting his manic highs and depressive lows, Bunyan created a new language for the interior life. He validated the experience of turmoil, showing generations of readers that their inner battles were not unique. He gave permission to be honest about doubt, to acknowledge the darkness, and still claim the hope. Ultimately, Bunyan's legacy is one of radical honesty. He teaches us that grace does not erase our past or our personality. Rather, it abounds precisely where we are most broken. His story remains a beacon for anyone navigating the dark nights of the soul, proving that even the chief of sinners can find enduring hope. Now it's time to move from Bunyan's story to your story. Over the next 7 days, we're going to apply these timeless lessons to navigate modern struggles with self-worth and purpose. Day 1, the mirror of truth. Bunyan began by facing his flaws head-on. Today, write down your anxieties without filtering them. No judgment, just honesty. Day 2, the weight of guilt. Understand that feeling heavy is often the first step toward needing relief. Don't suppress it. Observe it. Day 3, the battle of the mind. Learn to distinguish between destructive, intrusive thoughts and constructive conviction. Not every thought deserves your attention. Day 4, seeking the evidence. Stop looking inward for answers and start looking upward and outward. What promises have held others through their valleys? Day 5, the dawn of grace. Practice replacing fear with foundational truth. When anxiety strikes, speak the promise, grace is sufficient. Day 6, endurance through shadows. Growth is rarely linear. How do you handle setbacks without giving up? Build your resilience plan. Day 7, the sufficient grace. This is your day of rest and realization. You don't have to be perfect to be secure. Let's walk this path from despair to assurance together. In grace abounding to the chief of sinners, we've traversed the turbulent landscape of John Bunyan's soul. This is more than a memoir. It's a raw, psychological portrait of crisis and redemption. Bunyan began in absolute darkness, describing his early life filled with rebellion and profound guilt. He viewed himself not merely as flawed, but as the absolute chief of sinners, convinced he was beyond redemption. The narrative followed his agonizing journey through what he called the slough of despond. He battled obsessive thoughts, terrifying visions of hell, and the crushing weight of legalism. He tried to earn his salvation through strict behavior, only to fail repeatedly, plunging deeper into despair. But the transition to light occurred when Bunyan shifted his focus from his own failures to the sufficiency of divine grace. The breakthrough came through specific scriptures that pierced his darkness, offering a promise that grace is greater than any sin. He realized his standing was not based on his performance, but on a completed work outside of himself. Ultimately, Bunyan emerged from his prison, both literal and psychological, with a message of hope. If the chief of sinners can find grace, then no one is truly beyond reach. It's a story of resilience, ending in the liberating light of assurance. John Bunyan's story isn't merely a historical account from the cold walls of a Bedford jail. It's a timeless mirror reflecting our own internal battles. We've journeyed with him through the deepest valleys of despair, felt a weight of his chains, and stood beside him as he finally glimpsed the overwhelming light of grace. But a book is only as good as the change it inspires. Now, the narrative shifts from his life to yours. This is your invitation to step onto the pilgrim's path. You don't need unshakable confidence or a spotless record. As we've seen, Bunyan had neither. All that is required is the courage to face your own shadows and the humility to accept a grace that far exceeds your failures. Perhaps you're currently wrestling with doubt. Maybe you're searching for a purpose that transcends the mundane pressures of bills, deadlines, and disappointing relationships. Maybe you're dealing with regret from choices you can't undo, or anxiety about a future you can't control. Whatever your burden, know that you don't walk this road alone. Countless travelers have gone before you, leaving behind guideposts of hope and resilience. Don't let this story end here. Let it be the catalyst for your own awakening. Look at your life. Where do you need forgiveness? Where do you need hope? The gate is open. The path is waiting. Step forward with faith. Leave your guilt at the cross and join the legion of pilgrims seeking the celestial city. Subscribe to this channel for more journeys through timeless wisdom. Comment below what part of Bunyan's story resonated most with you, and share this with someone who needs to hear that they're not too far gone. Your journey of grace begins now.